Bret the Hitman Hart. Make sure you watch the Wrestling Roundtable.
Welcome back to the Wrestling Roundtable. Support the show by going to the shop at WrestlingRoundtable.com and getting the Wrestling Roundtable t-shirt or Pro Wrestling Respect DVDs. Pro Wrestling Respect is also available to download at GFL.TV. We also have an Amazon shop, so if you want anything on Amazon.com, get it through our store and help support the show. We need your support, people. This is not cheap, easy, and free to do, so we put it out there for you. You can help support us, and we're glad you enjoy the show. So we're going to move on to the best and worst retirements, and introducing to my right, which is your left, returning to the table is Orlando O'Neill, fan of 22 years, and Grizzly Redwood is back too. So we're going to talk about the worst first and get it out of the way, as we usually do. Now, when it comes to retirements, before we even begin, of course, we need to address that most wrestlers don't stay retired whenever they do. We've seen guys like Piper and Terry Funk make 1 million comebacks in a decade.
Oh, yeah.
But there are other guys who stay away. There's not that many. There's a few Shawn Michaels out there. But unfortunately, a lot of the guys who do stay away end up doing that because they're injured. Mm-hmm. And it sucks. But outside of injuries, is a wrestler ever really retired?
No, not at all. And you say Shawn Michaels, it's not even been a year yet, so.
It's been about 1.5 years, but
has it been?
There's still plenty of time.
Definitely. It's really hard for a wrestler to retire. I mean, they really don't have any health insurance. They have no pension plan, so they need to generate money, and the easiest way for them to generate money is off of what they know, what they did their whole career. That's wrestling. Whether it's in the ring, in a backstage role, now they have agents, or just cameos.
Well, I remember Molly Holly saying something once like, why do wrestlers feel like we can only do one thing? Because we do so much. We can become travel agents. We know about traveling a lot. We know about physical fitness. There's lots of different career options they could do. Batista just opened a Gracie Jiu-Jitsu school.
Look at Trish Stratus and DDP. They do yoga now.
Right. So not everyone ends up like Jake the Snake or Iron Sheik or Greg Valentine where they have to do these little backyard shows or whatever the fuck. So it really depends on how your lifestyle goes. Woo. But what do you think are some of the worst retirements in wrestling? I'm guessing that most of them are going to be injury related.
Yeah, only a few people that really get to go out with such fanfare, because there's so many wrestlers, man. There's so little places to go.
And not everyone's a legend, despite what the word's thrown around as.
I also base retirement on, if you're making a living off it, you can retire. If you're not making a living off it, you're just kind of quitting a hobby, really. Mm-hmm. I kind of know Ric Flair's retirement after how it ended. Seeing how he didn't retire.
It taints the first one.
Yeah, it was amazing. I loved watching it. I watched it as a fan. It was great.
It was heartfelt.
Yeah. Now it seems a lot less heartfelt now that he's back. So I feel a little slighted by the situation as a fan.
Yeah, Ricky Steamboat in 1994, even though he did have his comeback a couple years ago, he wrestled Jericho.
Way different time span, though.
Definitely. I mean, he's still in pretty good shape, but in 94, definitely. But in 94, he's having a great feud with Steve Austin, and all of a sudden, a little back bump messed his back, and his career was over.
Someone else whose back got messed up around that time, too, was Ravishing Rick Rude. And that is such a goddamn shame. Because
that was a bad bump.
Yeah. I just posted it actually on our Facebook group page because I'm sure a lot of people didn't see it. It was years before YouTube and before, I guess if you did tape trading or something, you could see it. But it was in New Japan. Sting did a plancha over the top. Rude just cracked his back in half against this ramp. And it was really horrible to see. He was in great shape. He had a great run in WCW at that point. Right. And it's really disappointing to think about the things he could have done with those guys that were there a few years later.
It seems like as soon as Hogan came in 94, everybody started falling out of place. Everybody was leaving.
That's not even number one that I think of, because I think of Bret Hart first. Because that was such a terrible end to such a great career. And I know a lot of people like to say, because it's easy, that Goldberg ended his career, but it's really not that simple, especially if you read his book and how they kept asking him to do shows, and he said, well, I don't feel too good, but this was still before Benoit and still before a lot of concussion stuff really came out. So he didn't really know the extent of how bad that was. So he might have been okay if he had taken time off after that match. But he kept bumping and bumping and bumping, and the stars kept adding up. And eventually it just got so bad that his last match was on a Thunder the Thursday before Sold Out 2000 in a hardcore match against Terry Funk. That was such a bad way for Bret Hart, of all people, to go out. That was very sad to see.
I agree completely.
Mick Foley in 2000.
Yes, and I'm sure you mean WrestleMania 2000, not No Way Out.
Not No Way Out. No Way Out was a beautiful way to go. It was building Triple H. Triple H was a monster heel that everybody loved to hate, and it was very emotional. Cactus Jack left the ring with put his hand raised. Jim Ross is all emotional. It was a great match.
Yeah, it was. Foley was one of those guys that, no, let me be used to build somebody up.
Again, though, is that even retirement?
Well, it wasn't, but that's why it sucked, like
Yeah.
Orlando said, because they didn't really have a plan. They kept changing for WrestleMania 2000, and they're like, hey, can you come back just so we can have a fucking McMahon in a fourth corner, I guess.
And then he comes back a couple weeks later, all out of shape.
Oh, but because he didn't expect it. Because
Okay.
they called him up, and he's like, all right, I guess I'll do it for the payday, but it was just so anticlimactic.
I mean, even so, though, like, it's still not retirement. He came back and wrestled still for years.
I know, but that's why I said at the beginning, like before we even started taping, this is not going to be restricted to I have to stay retired because we had to talk for 5 minutes.
Yeah,
because it can't be restricted like that because there's so few examples. And unfortunately, another one, not necessarily injury related like a back break or a concussion, but really just wear and tear, was Macho Man Randy Savage in 2004. It had been a few years between WCW and that, and he really wasn't seen very much. So he pops up in TNA, and what was funny is your first impression was like, well, Savage is this egomaniac and probably decided not to job or some shit, and they had to pull this impromptu angle in that stupid six-man tag with Jeff Hardy and the Outsiders or whatever. But it ended up, and this is really sad, it ended up being that he was just so embarrassed with the shape he was in, he didn't want to be seen like that. He didn't want people's last impression of him to be that. And unfortunately, that's what it was. They took him out of the match with the angle backstage, and he got beat up. So Jeff Hardy and AJ Styles wrestle the whole match, and Savage comes in at the end, throws a punch, does a counter to a sunset flip, looking like an old man pinning Jeff Jarrett. I didn't want that to be the last time we saw Macho Man.
Yeah, it's a sad end to probably one of the better careers in wrestling, I think, in history.
What do you think about Stone Cold's? And I'm counting WrestleMania 19 against The Rock.
I mean, they didn't know going into that it was going to be his last match.
And that's why I have reservations about it.
I love it, though. I'd rather not know going in. He's one of the greatest of all time.
That's what I mean.
And
He's one of the best of all time. Don't you think he deserves something more grandiose?
Yeah, I mean, but doesn't really need it, does he?
I think he still may even get it. I think, even though a lot of people still speculate, but who knows? He still might have that one match in him.
He pulled a Jerry Seinfeld. He went out on top.
Yeah, he did.
Well, what about Goldberg? Because it was around the same time a year later. Is it because the match is so tainted that his last match, I mean, he went off on WrestleMania 20, one of the biggest shows of all time, against a guy in a dream match and got the win clean, but is everything just so muddy around that?
Everybody knew everybody was leaving.
Yeah.
What about Batista? Do you think that should have had a better exit instead of him as the heel, just I quit and leaving, we never see him again?
Yeah, I like that because it opens up the door for him to come back.
What about these guys, like I mentioned Jake the Snake before, like I think he just had his retirement match earlier this year against Kazarni on some indie show.
Yeah.
Don't you think that a lot of these guys who keep going, maybe because they have to, longer than they should, deserve something a little better? Like, this is a guy who shows up every once in a blue moon for WWE to put Randy Orton over or whatever, and a lot of these guys still have contacts. Don't you think WWE could even give them, like, I'm not saying a pay-per-view, but just like even a match on Raw?
At this point, do they really need it? I mean, there's so much time on TV. Like, do they need to bring Jake the Snake back to say he's retiring from pro wrestling?
Why not?
I think most of the core fans in general...
They're desperate for content as it is, aren't they?
Most people that knew Jake the Snake that would still be watching today probably pretty much just assumed he retired anyway.
Let's undo Bret Hart coming back then.
I was all right with that. That's a different story.
Well, speaking of these guys, do you think, mentioning Ric Flair, mentioning Shawn Michaels, depending on their financial situation, of course, do you think that they should stay retired more? Like, don't these guys like Piper and Snuka who show up looking like zombies in the Royal Rumble once a year, shouldn't they have a little more dignity or pride in themselves and like, all right, I can stay away? Or are they just having fun?
A lot of it has to do with the nostalgia. People want to see their childhood heroes in the ring, and they're there to give it to them, and of course it brings them back to their younger days where they were relevant, and probably brings that energy with them.
Every once in a while, yeah, it's okay. This is why I think in general people need to stay away from like retirement matches because everybody's always going to come back and it taints the whole thing altogether.
Whoever believes it anyway.
Yeah.
Even when we were younger and watching Macho Man and Ultimate Warrior, Savage lost because a lot of us didn't see some of the earlier WWF stuff, so we didn't know that it's wrestling. It's not going to be stuck to that stipulation. And it's funny watching back now. Savage lost his retirement match. It was great angle. Year later, he's in the title match. But we're going to move on to some of the best retirements in pro wrestling next.
皆さんこんにちは。プロレスリングノアのケンタです。レスリングラウンドテーブル絶対見逃さないように。
Welcome back to the Wrestling Roundtable. Join us on all our social networking sites. Facebook, we've got 2 pages, a group page and a fan page. We are also on Twitter and iTunes and Go Fight Live, Blog Talk Radio, and YouTube, of course. So get all the links on WrestlingRoundtable.com. Twitter. Joining the panel, Brett Midge Simonello to my right, which is your left, fan of 25 years, and Will Brooks joins us as well. And before we move on to some ideas of the best retirements in wrestling, a question, because we kind of touched upon it in the last segment. Is there such a thing as an ideal retirement in wrestling? What would that be?
Well, I'm going to use an example for it, Ric Flair's. Because, again, it was big, it was poignant, heartfelt, and completely satisfied. Everybody saw it was like, yes, that was the perfect way to end his career. But you don't have to be as big as Ric Flair. As long as it makes sense and it leaves you satisfied to say, that guy had a good career, I'm glad he's walking away now.
What about someone like Stone Cold Steve Austin? We said there wasn't any publicity about that at all. We didn't know about it till after the fact. Going off in the sunset that way, how's that work?
I wouldn't call that the ideal retirement because it wasn't a voluntary retirement. It was a forced retirement. I would say the ideal retirement would be somebody like Trish Stratus, who goes out on her own terms, walking, not going to be in a wheelchair in 20 years. She has her financial stability with her yoga, just like Grizzly said. Retirement is when you can walk away from something and still not worry about your paycheck from week to week. So I think Trish would be the prime example.
All right, well, those are 2 good ideas so far, but do you have any more for the best and worst retirements? The best retirements.
Well, I already mentioned Flair. I'm going to mention one of the people I haven't thought of too much is Tommy Dreamer. In the same sense, it's satisfied. Granted, it was like ECW point too.
Right, doesn't that go along with what I was saying in the last segment? Like, Tommy Dreamer's not a huge name, but at least he got some sort of send-off on the TV show, even if it was a B show.
And he lost to Zack Ryder. Zack Ryder put him into retirement. I mean, at least for a couple months, and then he was turned out to be on TNA. But his WWE one was pretty cool. Again, I get the dresser fans like, hey, I love all you guys. And of course, Beulah McGillicuddy with their twin daughters was in the front row too, and she still looks kind of good.
Well, I don't know if this was exactly his retirement match. It was certainly towards the latter end of his career in one of his last matches, but in 1979, Buddy Rogers passed the torch to Ric Flair. The name, the move, the figure 4 leg lock, he got the robe, the Nature Boy, and it was really christening Ric Flair, who was only a few years into his career, as the new Nature Boy. Wonder if Undertaker will do something like that soon, or will we get Triple H, Undertaker at WrestleMania 3 2 years in a row? But that's what I mean, like, that was a great idea of Nature Boy, Buddy Rogers, passing the torch to someone else coming up, and Ric Flair ran with it and became known as the Nature Boy in a completely different way.
Is there a question?
Some ideas for the best.
Oh. To touch back.
How long have you been doing this fucking show?
I don't drink anymore. To go back to your last show, you mentioned the Macho Man Randy Savage in one of the most underrated WrestleManias, when WrestleMania was WrestleMania, against the Ultimate Warrior. I feel that was one of the best retirements because from point A to point B, the whole storyline was thought out and it invested in the fan, especially since we were little kids and it was completely believable to us because we didn't know any better. But they had the great match at WrestleMania. The Macho Man hit 3 different elbows. He didn't pin him.
I think it was like 5.
Yeah, and he couldn't pin him, and he finally lost. Then you had the whole emotional thing with Sensational Sherry and Miss Elizabeth joining back together with Macho Man. And then it went on throughout the months as Macho Man was commentating, and then on primetime he'd come back with signs saying reinstate the Macho Man.
That was later on with the Jake the Snake
But it was throughout the whole thing, and I'm sure there was some sort of number that we called and got in trouble for paying money for. From point A to point B, and then finally, why do you come out of retirement? For a title match. It was just perfect the whole way.
Well, he came out of retirement for Jake the Snake before he moved on to Ric Flair. But
the Tuesday in Texas deal.
Yeah, it was still a great idea because it seemed for those first few months legit. Like, he was just doing the commentary. They did the wedding at SummerSlam, and of course it segued into there to the point where they put so much heat on Jake the Snake that you just, yes, he has to come out. We know it was a stipulation. He wants to stick to it, blah, blah, blah. But also the full circle the character came was really good too. But also a WrestleMania, and it was one of many retirements, but fine. Roddy Piper in 1987 at WrestleMania 3, building up to this Adrian Adonis match. He was saying this was going to be my last match, win, lose, or draw. He was going off to make They Live. And then Adrian Adonis, while Piper's gone, is starting to do his talk show too, and they put him in this ridiculous effeminate look and everything, and just became a real dick.
The flower shot?
Yep, and then Piper had to come back and set things right. And not even to connect it to the Brutus Beefcake angle they did afterwards, but just the idea that on this big show, Piper got this send-off as a babyface when he was the biggest heel in wrestling a couple years ago, I thought that was a really good one.
I think Shawn Michaels had a good one too. After he had another classic with Undertaker at WrestleMania, comes on Raw and addresses the fans, say, hey, Vince McMahon, I put the guy through a lot of shit, but hey, he was cool, stuck with me. Bret Hart, I put him through a lot of shit, but hey, we're cool now. Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.
He upped the ante from the year before where it was just him versus the Streak, Undertaker. Now he's putting his career on the line, too, and he deserved the time off. And it was a really good match and a good send-off. And like I said on the radio show Tuesday, he's had the decency to stay away since. And I'm sure at some point, maybe we'll get a Shawn Michaels match as much as he denies it, and who's really going to turn that down? But another one that sticks out to me is yet another guy who had many retirements and may still not be retired, I guess, but Terry Funk had a really good send-off in 1997, I believe it was September, at an ECW show. It was a tribute show to Terry Funk in Amarillo, Texas, put on by ECW. WWF wrestlers were on it, Mankind and Bret Hart was in the title match with Terry Funk, and Terry Funk lost. And even though he went out as the loser that night, still people loved Terry Funk. They still respect him. It didn't even really matter. He got a honorary title and everything. I thought that was a really classy way to go out.
Terry Funk putting people over even in his last match.
You got to give ECW a lot of credit for that, because that was one thing that promotion was built around. That was emotion. They knew how to tap into the fans, and the wrestlers gave everything they had. Those special moments is what made ECW. You can make a whole highlight reel out of not bloody, hardcore barbed wire stuff, out of just straight emotional wrestlers crying, fans really feeling sorry and happy for these guys.
Because they mean something to him. They connected to him in a good way. But much like Stone Cold's wasn't a big, grandiose sort of event, I like The Rock's in that sense. And I know he never officially retired, but there was that long stretch between 2004 and now where he was gone most of the time. And his last match was with, really, I wouldn't say the Rock and Sock because he was a Mankind goofy Socko shit, but Cactus Jack, Mick Foley, whatever, they re-teamed against Evolution in the handicap match, Batista, Orton, and Flair. That was a fun match. It was a great match in the middle of the card at WrestleMania 20, and even though I knew Rock was going off into the sunset of Hollywood after that, I still thought that was a good way to come back, help his friend, and get some attention to that sort of match. And hopefully we get your attention in the future, and stay with us on WrestlingRoundtable.com. Coming up next time, we're going to be talking about the Montreal Screwjob that you've all been wanting, and we're going to do the Submission Round 5 Q&A. So for the panel of Martin and Rodney LeConte, Will Brooks, Orlando O'Neill, Grizzly Redwood, Brett Midge Simonello, and Delirious, I'm the host, Eric Santamaria. Join us on WrestlingRoundtable.com.